The 19th Amendment, which acknowledges the right to vote in state and federal elections regardless of gender, was passed 100 years ago. And yes, that was a huge accomplishment and is one of my favorite constitutional amendments because I have those. But I want to acknowledge that that isn't the full story of voting rights in America. George Washington was unanimously elected president in 1976. At the time, 6% of the population could vote, which makes it a little less exciting in retrospect. States were given power over voting laws, but the vote was basically universally restricted to white men who owned land. You also had to be considered a citizen, which meant if you were an immigrant who wanted to vote someday, according to the 1790 Naturalization Act, you could become a citizen and attain the right to vote, provided you were a free white immigrant. It was a restrictive time. Fast forwarding 60 years or so to 1848, the Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York, and they adopted a resolution that called for voting rights for women. Also in 1848, the end of the Mexican-American War, which granted citizenship to Mexicans living in the newly conquered U.S. territory. However, English language requirements and violence would severely limit access to the ballot. A few years later, in 1856, the vote was expanded to all white men when North Carolina became the last state to remove property ownership as a prerequisite to voting rights. Then the Civil War happened. In 1868, the 14th Amendment passed and redefined citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the United States. This is actually the amendment that technically makes me a citizen, since I was born in the United States. It also officially made all former slaves citizens, as well as forbade states from denying any rights of citizenship to those slaves, although voting laws were still left up to whatever the individual states wanted to do, so things are sort of iffy. 2 years later, in 1870, the 15th Amendment passed, which says the right to vote can't be denied on the basis of race. Some states found other ways to deny the vote in ways that were motivated by race, but weren't explicitly race, like violence, intimidation, poll taxes, absurdly confusing literacy tests that I can't pass and are only administered to black voters, and white voters were grandfathered into being able to vote even if they couldn't pass those absurdly hard tests. Then in 1876, the Supreme Court ruled that Indigenous people aren't citizens under the 14th Amendment and therefore could not vote. About a decade later, this would be replaced by the Dawes Act in 1887, which granted citizenship to Indigenous people who gave up tribal affiliations and assimilated into the colonizing culture. In 1890, the Dawes Act would be replaced by the Indian Naturalization Act, which set up a process for granting citizenship via applications similar to the immigrant naturalization system that existed at the time. While that was happening, the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882. This is the first immigration law of the country and specifically excluded all immigration to the United States from China, and also banned people of Chinese ancestry who were already here from becoming U.S. citizens. In happier news, in 1890, Wyoming became a state and was the first state to include voting rights for women in their state constitution. Way to go, Wyoming! Then World War I happened, and in 1919, all Indigenous people who served in the military during the war were granted citizenship. A similar thing happened in 1925, but with Filipinos, when Congress banned members of a colony from obtaining citizenship unless they had served 3 years with the Navy. Tying citizenship and immigration status to military service is still a thing we do today, by the way. Overall, the 1920s weren't a great time for voting rights, despite the decade starting off right with the passage of the 19th Amendment, because the rallying cry of votes for women didn't practically apply to all women. Frequently, voting rights for non-white women were just ignored, because sometimes in the United States, we ignore your rights. The Supreme Court would decide in 1922 and 1923 that people of Japanese and Indian heritage were not eligible to become naturalized citizens, and in 1926, a group of black women in Birmingham, Alabama were beaten by election officials just for attempting to register to vote. Things seemed to be okay when in 1924 the Indian Citizenship Act granted citizens to all Indigenous people, but a lot of states would still create laws and policies that would prohibit them from voting. That would come to an end though in 1947 when Miguel Trujillo Marin, a grad student, a member of the Isleta Pueblo tribe, sued the state of New Mexico for not allowing him to vote. And then he won the case, and legal barriers to voting were removed for Indigenous people, who had been consistently denied the right to vote on their own land. Just 5 years later, the McCarran-Walter Act granted all people of Asian ancestry to become citizens. This overturned the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Supreme Court decisions from the 1920s around Asian citizenship. In 1961, the 23rd Amendment gave citizens of Washington, D.C. the right to vote for president. They still don't have voting representation in Congress, though, despite being the nation's capital. And you should watch my other video about DC statehood to learn more about that. Now it is time for the civil rights movement, where a large-scale, organized movement consistently demanded and worked for voting rights. In 1964, the 24th Amendment passed, guaranteeing the right to vote in federal elections will not be denied for a failure to pay any tax. This was specifically getting rid of the poll taxes of the era. Then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed, forbidding states from imposing discriminatory restrictions on who can vote. It was successful largely because the federal government acted to enforce the law and ensured voting rights were protected. In 1971, Vietnam War protesters would demand the lowering of the voting age because anyone eligible to be drafted for a war they don't believe in should at least be able to get to vote for the leader sending them to war, and thus the voting age was lowered to 18, where it remains today. In 1975, amendments to the Voting Rights Act would also make it so voting materials were printed in multiple languages, so people who did not read English could still participate in their voting process as U.S. citizens. Then in 1993, the National Voter Registration Act passed and made voter registration available at the DMV, public assistance offices, and disabilities agencies. This really helped make the vote more accessible. In 2000, a federal court decided that people in U.S. territories are citizens, but are ineligible to vote with the exception of Washington, D.C. This is still true today. It's garbage. And this is more or less where we are at as a country now. Things still vary from state to state, like voter ID laws, if early voting is available, if you can vote by mail, or if you can vote if you've been convicted of a felon at any point in your life. You should check what the voting laws are in your specific state, and I'm going to be linking a channel down in the Chamber of Secrets that will tell you how to vote in every state. We've come a long way since 6% of the population was eligible to vote for George Washington. Heck, we've come a long way since the 19th Amendment passed 100 years ago. There's still more to do though. And here's what you can do. 1. Make sure you're registered to vote. 2. Make sure your family and friends are registered to vote. 3. Learn more about your state's voting laws. 4. Vote in every election. And 5. Volunteer and donate to nonprofits working on voter enfranchisement, or to a candidate that will work to protect your right to vote. Thanks for joining me for a brief overview of the complex history of voting rights. I didn't do it justice. If you want to see more from me, please subscribe, watch another video of mine, or support me on Patreon. And hey, I love you.